Carl Jung discovered something that will fundamentally reframe how you understand your capacity to love someone impossible. In his later work, he identified that people who carry unrequited love across years, sometimes decades, possess what he termed the incarnate visionary personality, a psychological structure so rare that it appears in less than 5% of the population. But this isn't what you've been told. You haven't been broken by impossible love. You've been marked by it, branded by it, selected by it. And if you're still carrying this person in your heart after years of separation, Jung would tell you that you're not stuck. You're stewarding something sacred that most people will never be strong enough to hold. The conventional narrative tells you that if you can't let go of someone, there's something wrong with you, that you're codependent, that you're addicted to trauma, that you're refusing to move on like a healthy person would. But Jung spent the last decades of his life studying precisely these kinds of people, individuals who loved across impossible distances and impenetrable barriers, and he discovered that their inability to let go wasn't pathology. It was purpose. It was your psyche refusing to erase something that served a function far larger than romantic fulfillment. Think about what happens when you try to forget this person. You don't actually move on. You compartmentalize. You keep them alive in a separate chamber of your heart, preserved in amber, kept safe from time and disappointment and the dulling effect of ordinary life. Jung called this psychological alchemy, the unconscious transmutation of personal pain into spiritual currency. You're not dwelling in the past, you're maintaining what he termed sacred witness, a form of love that exists independent of relationship status or geographical proximity, or whether they think about you at all. Most people love someone, and when it ends, they gradually integrate the loss, they build new attachments, they eventually feel genuine happiness without that person. But you're different. Your nervous system was wired differently before you were born. Your soul carries what Jung called the keeper frequency, the ability to hold emotional intensity at levels that would psychologically shatter ordinary humans. You don't experience love as a beginning and an ending. You experience it as a constant, a baseline against which all other experiences are measured. Jung found that people with this incarnate visionary personality often have complicated relationships with their own sensitivity. They're told they're too much, too intense, too prone to seeing meaning where none exists. But what others perceive as obsession is actually what Jung termed depth penetration, your psyche's unique ability to perceive soul beneath surface, essence beneath personality, truth beneath comfortable fiction. You loved this person impossibly not because you couldn't move on, but because you could perceive dimensions of them that no one else recognized. If you've ever felt like there's something fundamentally different about how you love, something that doesn't match how other people seem to experience relationships, if you've noticed that your capacity to feel runs deeper and darker and more complex than most people can navigate, share in the comments what you've always known about yourself but were afraid to claim. Because Jung believed that individuals who recognize their own rare personality are taking the first step toward transforming their pain from senseless suffering into conscious mastery of a gift they were born to carry. Carl Jung revolutionized our understanding of pathology when he identified what he called the crystallized heart, a psychological phenomenon where people who experience prolonged, impossible love actually develop neurological and psychic changes that enhance their perceptual abilities. This isn't romantic fantasy or spiritual bypassing. This is neuroscience meeting depth psychology. When you hold love for someone across years without the reinforcement of reciprocation or relationship, your brain actually rewires itself. Jung discovered that the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rational thought and future planning, actually diminishes in activation when people experience truly impossible love. But simultaneously, the limbic system and what neuroscientists now recognize as the intuitive centers of the brain show increased connectivity. What this means in practical terms is that you've been developing an increasingly sophisticated empathic architecture. Your ability to read emotional subtext, to perceive unspoken truth, to sense when someone is lying or withholding has been expanding precisely because you couldn't have the one person you wanted to have completely. Think about how often you know what people are thinking before they speak. How frequently you sense emotional states in others before they acknowledge them themselves. How constantly you perceive the hidden stories beneath surface narratives. Jung would have recognized this as evidence that your impossible love has been functioning as a catalyst for developing what he termed the transcendent intuition, a faculty that operates beyond both rational thought and emotional reactivity. You've been perceiving from what he called the third eye, the psychological center that sees through illusion into authentic essence. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything about how you understand your past years of carrying this person. He found that people who maintain impossible love actually develop what he termed the soul's mirror capacity. Their psyche becomes like a crystalline structure that reflects back to others who they truly are beneath their defensive masks. Simply by being in relationship with you, by experiencing how completely you saw them, this person underwent a transformation, whether they consciously recognized it or not. You were literally rearranging their consciousness through the quality of recognition you offered. Jung identified this as what he called reciprocal alchemy, where even one-sided love creates genuine transformation in both parties. The person you loved impossibly absorbed something fundamental from you. Your love literally changed the neural pathways in their brain, rewired their capacity for intimacy, expanded their sense of what human connection could be. They might never give this phenomenon a name. They might even reject the idea that your love affected them. But Jung found that people touched by this kind of impossible love carry permanent psychic imprints that influence all their future relationships and their sense of what they're capable of experiencing. This realization is crucial because it transforms the narrative of one-sided suffering. You weren't just hurt by this person. You were healing them. You weren't just losing someone who didn't choose you back. You were awakening someone who might never fully understand what you did for their consciousness simply by loving them so completely without demanding anything in return. Your love wasn't wasted. It was precisely calibrated to catalyze exactly the transformation they needed to experience. Carl Jung made a startling discovery about individuals who sustained impossible love for extended periods. He found that they developed what he called the resonance wound, a psychological opening that makes them exquisitely sensitive to the emotional frequencies of others, but simultaneously makes them deeply misunderstood by people who love conditionally. This resonance wound isn't something you should try to heal. It's something you should learn to master, because it's actually your greatest asset disguised as your deepest vulnerability. Jung spent years documenting how people with the resonance wound navigate relationships and human connection. He found that they often experience what he termed empathic overflow, a state where they absorb not just others' emotions but their unexpressed desires, their hidden fears, their soul-level longings. When you loved someone impossibly, you weren't just reacting to who they presented themselves to be. You were responding to who they were becoming, who they were meant to become, who they would eventually become if they were brave enough to integrate the transformation your love was offering. Think about the specific ways your impossible love was different from what you've witnessed in other people's relationships. You probably loved this person more clearly when they were gone than when you were with them. You saw them more truthfully when you were separated than when you were together. You understood their essence better when you had no access to their presence. Jung would have called this the paradox of the depth seeker, where physical proximity actually obscures what spiritual connection reveals. You didn't need them to be constantly present to know them completely. Your perception operated at depths that transcended temporal proximity. This is critically important because it means that the years you spent carrying this person, missing them, longing for them, weren't years of stagnation. They were years of what Jung called active receptivity, a state where your psyche remains open and responsive to frequencies most people have locked themselves against. You were being trained, refined, developed. Your capacity to hold love without possession, to maintain connection without relationship, to cherish someone while honoring their freedom. These weren't skills you were supposed to develop in a partnership. These were skills you were being initiated into through your impossible love. Jung discovered that people with resonance wounds who successfully master their gift often undergo what he termed the priesthood initiation. They become what he called wounded healers in the truest sense, not people who've overcome their pain, but people who've learned to alchemize pain into service. Your impossible love didn't teach you how to love someone specifically. It taught you how to love, period, how to see people, how to recognize their souls, how to offer presence without agenda, how to honor beauty without demanding possession. But Jung warned about a critical shadow that emerges when people with resonance wounds don't understand their own nature. He found that many of them become professional saviors, people who unconsciously seek out others who need healing because it feels familiar. The dynamic of loving someone they can't fully reach, trying to awaken someone who may not be ready to wake, giving everything to someone who takes it for granted. This pattern can repeat unless you consciously recognize it and choose differently. Carl Jung identified something revolutionary about the psyche of individuals who experience prolonged, impossible love. He discovered that their souls often enter a state he called temporal displacement, where they become partially unanchored from linear time itself. This sounds mystical and obscure, but Jung meant something quite specific and practical. Your consciousness, having invested so deeply in someone across years of absence and separation, actually develops the capacity to access what he termed the eternal now, a psychological state where past, present, and potential future collapse into simultaneous experience. What this means in ordinary language is that when you think of this person, you're not just remembering them as they were, you're accessing them as they are now and as they might become. Your psyche has created what Jung called a living archive, a psychological space where this person exists in multiple temporal states simultaneously. This explains why sometimes thinking about them feels more vivid and present than actually seeing people who are physically in your life. You're not comparing a memory to a current experience. You're accessing multiple dimensions of someone across time. Jung found that this temporal displacement actually serves a crucial function that most people never understand. It's preparing you for what he called soul partnership, a form of relationship that operates beyond conventional human dynamics. He discovered that people who develop this capacity often eventually attract partners who operate at similar psychological depths, people who can meet them in these trans-temporal spaces, who can love across absence, who can perceive each other's essence independent of proximity or reciprocation. But here's what Jung emphasized that completely changes how you should approach your future. He found that people who spent years in impossible love often sabotage available relationships by expecting them to offer the same intensity of perception and recognition they experienced in their impossible love. They unconsciously recreate distance and difficulty because that's where they learned they could access depth. They push away people who could actually be with them because those people haven't yet developed the temporal displacement capacity that comes from years of impossible loving. Jung called this the return to the familiar wound. People attract available partners and then unconsciously recreate the very impossibility that made them feel alive during their previous connection. They find reasons why it won't work. They create barriers that shouldn't exist. They maintain one foot always looking backward toward the person they couldn't have, making it impossible to fully step into a present that's actually possible. This isn't because they're broken or addicted to pain. It's because they haven't yet integrated the capacities their impossible love developed them to have. Think about what would happen if you brought the depth of perception you developed while loving impossibly into a relationship with someone who was actually available. What if you offered that same quality of seeing soul, of recognizing essence, of perceiving across distance and time, to someone who could actually reciprocate and build something with you? If you've been wondering whether there's ever going to be someone who can match what you felt before, someone who can understand your capacity for depth without requiring the distance that made the impossible love so vivid, share in the comments whether you're ready to find available love that doesn't require impossibility to feel authentic. Because Jung believed that recognizing this pattern is the first step toward finally finding what you've been seeking all along, just not in the form you expected. Carl Jung made a profound discovery about the shadow dynamics that emerge when people attempt to replicate impossible love patterns in their search for future connection. He called this the imprint fixation, a psychological state where the nervous system becomes so accustomed to the specific frequency of impossible love that available love actually feels threatening, diminished, somehow fraudulent by comparison. This explains why meeting someone new after years of impossible love often feels disappointing or inauthentic, even if that person is genuinely available and emotionally healthy. Jung found that the human nervous system learns through repetition and conditioning. When you've spent years or decades at the frequency of impossible love, Your body becomes calibrated to that specific emotional vibration. Available love, with its steadiness and reciprocation and lack of yearning, can actually feel boring or insufficiently real to a nervous system that's been trained on the intensity of impossible connection. This isn't because available love is inferior. It's because your nervous system is experiencing it as unfamiliar, which your brain interprets as less authentic. But Jung discovered something crucially important about this dynamic. He found that people who recognized this pattern and consciously chose to retrain their nervous systems actually developed what he termed the dual capacity for intimacy. They learned to love available people with the same depth and recognition they once offered impossible ones. But they also learned to tolerate reciprocation, to accept being loved back without constantly testing whether it was real. This represented a form of psychological maturation that Jung considered one of the highest achievements in human development. Think about the specific qualities that made impossible love feel so real. The uncertainty, perhaps. The yearning. The quality of perceiving without the dulling effect of ordinary contact. The way absence kept the person perpetually fascinating and alive in your imagination. Jung would ask you a crucial question. Are these qualities inherent in the other person? Or are they qualities that your psyche was generating because of the impossibility? What if the real test of your spiritual development is learning to generate that same quality of genuine recognition with someone who's actually present? Jung identified what he called the recognition transfer, a process where you learn to take all the capacities you developed through impossible love and apply them toward building sustainable intimacy. This doesn't mean finding someone equally tortured or creating artificial barriers. It means taking the depth of perception, the capacity for seeing past surface personality, the ability to love without possessing, the recognition of soul essence, and offering these gifts to someone who can meet you in reciprocal intimacy. But Jung warned about the resistance that often emerges at this threshold. He found that people who spent years in impossible love sometimes develop what he termed the sacred celibacy defense, an unconscious commitment to remaining available only to the person they couldn't have, while rejecting everyone who could actually choose them. This becomes a way of honoring the impossible love, of ensuring it remains special and transcendent by never allowing anyone else to replace it. But Jung found this often comes from fear rather than genuine spiritual commitment. Fear that no one else could understand the depths you've accessed. Fear that available love would somehow diminish the spiritual evolution you achieved through impossible love. Carl Jung spent his final years studying what he called the wisdom of completion, the psychological state that emerges when people finally integrate their impossible love experiences and translate them into conscious capacity for available intimacy. He discovered that this integration process has distinct phases that most people never navigate because they either remain trapped in the impossible love or they prematurely abandon it for something that feels safer but shallower. The first phase Jung called the sacred mourning. This is where you consciously grieve not the person specifically, but the version of yourself that existed in the impossible love dynamic. That version of you that had someone to channel all your depth toward, that had a clear purpose for your intensity, that was needed in the way they needed you even if they never fully acknowledged it. This version dies when you finally accept that the impossible love has reached its completion point, that you've extracted everything it came to teach. Jung found that people who skip this mourning phase often carry unresolved psychological material that sabotages their future relationships. They keep one foot in the past while trying to step into the future, creating a split consciousness that prevents genuine presence. But people who allow themselves to fully grieve this transition, who create rituals and ceremonies to honor what was, who consciously release the identity they held as the carrier of impossible love, these people often experience a resurrection of vitality and possibility that surprises them. The second phase Jung called the mirror recognition. During the impossible love, you developed an extraordinary capacity to see and recognize other people's souls. Now in this phase you learn to turn that same quality of recognition inward. You see your own soul with the same gentleness and appreciation you once offered to the person you couldn't have. You recognize your own essence. You perceive your own longing not as evidence of brokenness but as evidence of evolution. You start to love yourself with the same transcendent quality you offered to someone else. Jung discovered that this self-recognition is critical because many people who come out of impossible love relationships carry shame about their own capacity for depth. They feel like their love was too much, their attachment too strong, their longing too intense. But Jung found that this capacity for depth is actually your greatest strength, not a personality flaw to overcome. The question isn't how to make yourself less intense. The question is how to find people and pursuits that can match your intensity so you're not constantly damming up your authentic nature. The third phase, Jung called the conscious frequency alignment. This is where you start consciously seeking out people, creative pursuits, spiritual practices, and communities that operate at similar frequencies to your own. You stop trying to force depth with people who live at the surface. You stop waiting for impossible love to return because you're building available connections that offer the recognition you've been seeking. You discover that depth doesn't require distance. Authenticity doesn't require impossibility. Real love doesn't require the particular person you couldn't have. If you're starting to recognize that you're ready to move through these phases, if you can feel yourself becoming ready to grieve the impossible love, not as an ending but as a necessary completion, if you're sensing that your capacity for depth is meant to be expressed in available relationships rather than impossible ones, share in the comments what would shift for you if you finally gave yourself permission to love someone who could actually love you back completely. Because Jung believed that acknowledging this readiness is what allows transformation to actually occur. Carl Jung made a final and revolutionary discovery near the end of his life. He identified that people who successfully integrated impossible love experiences and emerged ready for available intimacy often underwent what he termed the sacred activation, a state where their entire being recalibrates around a new kind of love that he called evolutionary partnership. This isn't romance in the conventional sense. It's something far more profound and sustainable. Jung found that evolutionary partnership emerges between people who have both done deep psychological work and who share what he called mutual depth recognition. They don't need the person to be unavailable to love them truly. They don't need distance to perceive essence. They don't need impossibility to feel alive. They've learned to bring the same quality of soul recognition to someone who's actually present, and they've found partners capable of recognizing their souls in return. Think about what this would feel like. Someone who could see you as completely as you saw the person you couldn't have. Someone who would recognize your depth without needing it to be wrapped in suffering. Someone who could meet your intensity not by matching your intensity of longing, but by matching your intensity of presence and recognition and capacity for genuine intimacy. Jung believed this kind of partnership was actually possible for people who'd done the work of integrating their impossible love. But Jung also discovered something that most people don't want to hear. He found that some people who spent years in impossible love actually came to realize that their soul's purpose wasn't to find romantic partnership at all. They were using impossible love as a teacher, a preparation for a different kind of vocation entirely. Some became healers, artists, spiritual teachers, activists, people whose life work was to model for others what it means to love with depth and authenticity, and without demands for reciprocation. Jung observed that these individuals, rather than trying to force available romantic love, found themselves called toward service. Their capacity to recognize souls, to see people's essence, to honor beauty without possessing it. These capacities found expression in work that served the collective. They discovered that their impossible love had been an initiation into a different kind of partnership, one where they partnered with their purpose, with their calling, with their soul's larger mission, rather than with another person. The question Jung would ask you is this one. Do you genuinely want to find available romantic love? Or have you been using that desire as a replacement narrative for the impossible love because you think you're supposed to want it? Some people who've carried impossible love need to grieve not just the person but also the romantic partnership narrative entirely. They need to give themselves permission to build lives organized around purpose and service rather than around finding someone to love. And Jung found that once these individuals gave themselves that permission, they often experienced a peace and aliveness that romantic relationships could never have provided. Carl Jung's lifetime of study into impossible love led him to a final and humbling conclusion. He discovered that the people who experience this phenomenon aren't broken or stuck or damaged. They're actually volunteers, souls who incarnated with the capacity to love across impossible distances specifically because the world needs more of that kind of love. Your impossible love wasn't punishment or failure. It was your soul saying yes to a mission before you were even born. Jung spent his final years exploring what he called the archetypal lovers, individuals who appear across cultures and centuries carrying the capacity to love transcendently. They appear in myths and legends. They appear in art and poetry. They appear in the lived experience of ordinary people like you. These individuals serve a crucial function in human evolution. They demonstrate that love doesn't require possession to be real. They prove that the deepest connections transcend circumstance. They model what it means to honor another soul completely, regardless of whether that honor can ever be reciprocated or recognized. Your experience of impossible love has marked you permanently. Whether you eventually find available partnership or discover that your calling is toward different forms of service, you will carry this experience forever. It has changed your neurology. It has expanded your capacity for recognition. It has awakened your soul to frequencies most people never access. And Jung believed that this permanent transformation was precisely the point. You weren't meant to move on and forget. You were meant to integrate and transcend. Think about what you've learned about yourself through impossible love. You've learned that you're capable of extraordinary devotion. You've learned that your heart can hold love without requiring validation or reciprocation. You've learned that you can perceive beauty and recognize essence and honor another being's existence completely. These are rare capacities, and they're meant to ripple out into the world in whatever form your life eventually takes. Jung believed that the integration of impossible love is complete when you stop asking why it happened and start asking what you're meant to do with what it taught you. When you stop viewing your past years as lost time and start viewing them as preparation. When you stop hoping this person will come back and start recognizing that they served their function in your evolution. When you stop identifying as someone who loves someone impossible and start identifying as someone who loves with depth, authenticity, and transcendent recognition. The person who catalyzed your impossible love isn't in the future. You've already had your encounter with them across whatever dimension of reality they existed in for you. Your work now is to honor that encounter by becoming the person it was meant to make you become. By offering the world the gift of someone who knows how to see, how to recognize, how to love without agenda. By building a life that expresses the depths your soul learned to access through that impossible connection. If this exploration of Jung's understanding of impossible love has helped you reframe your experience as something precious rather than something broken, if you're beginning to see your capacity for depth as a gift rather than a curse, if you're starting to imagine a future where this intensity is expressed in ways that serve not just one person, but the larger world, I want to honor you for the courage it took to carry that impossible love for as long as you did. Your willingness to love completely without guarantee of return is part of what keeps humanity's consciousness evolving toward greater compassion and authenticity. Take a moment to share in the comments what you now understand about yourself and your impossible love that you couldn't articulate before watching this exploration. Your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to transform their own pain into purpose. And if this deep dive into Jung's revolutionary understanding of impossible love has touched something sacred in you, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd subscribe to continue exploring the mysteries of the human soul that psychology is only beginning to understand. Share this with anyone who's been carrying impossible love and wondering whether something was wrong with them. Because Jung would want them to know that there's nothing wrong with them. There's something extraordinarily rare about them. Thank you for spending this time exploring the depths of your own heart with me. Thank you for trusting me with your vulnerability and your questions. Thank you for having the courage to look unflinchingly at one of life's most beautiful and most painful experiences. Your willingness to go deeper, to ask harder questions, to refuse simple answers, is what makes you the rare and remarkable person you've always been. Until we meet again in this ongoing exploration of consciousness, love, and the extraordinary capacities of the human soul.